Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the self-titled debut album from the side project of Deftones frontman Chino Moreno, titled Cross. Now, first let's briefly talk about nu metal. Born in the early half of the 90s, but exploding in the latter half of that decade, it was a genre I only happened to listen to in retrospect years after its popularity crashed and burned, taking its rock bottom reputation with it. Widely considered by metal purists to be a mainstream sellout of real metal, it's a genre that tends to inspire a lot of negative comparisons. And look, while there is some material quality if you look hard enough for it, there isn't much. And while I tend to be more forgiving of nu metal than some metal fans and some critics, the lack of authenticity and texture in the instrumentation combined with atrociously whiny lyrics and a meat-headed attitude just tended to set my teeth on edge. I mean, like, at least when hair metal or crunk got sleazy and borderline misogynist, it at least sounded attractive and fun, while nu metal was just content to wallow in its own misery. And since I never really had an angry white boy phase, I can never take that sort of attitude remotely seriously. And you know what? The depressing fact is I think it might be coming back. Though I didn't review Of Mice and Men's most recent album, Restoring Force, I definitely heard plenty of the hallmarks of nu metal on that album. And combined with new acts like Amir and the Hollywood Undead, and popular revival of acts like Korn and Stained and Limp Bizkit, I get the unpleasant feeling we have not yet seen the last of that unfortunate genre. But here's something that's kind of ironic. Nu metal's worst critics tend to be former nu metal artists. And this takes us to Deftones and lead singer Chino Moreno. Deftones have a better reputation than most nu metal acts, mostly because they were a bit more abstract in their lyrical focus, and they jumped off the bandwagon towards the alternative metal, post-metal scene, which is obviously a good choice. Now, I've never really been much of a Deftones fan, but the critical acclaim that the band has received was enough to get me to look into the debut album from Chino Moreno's side project, Crosses, with promises that it was more melodic and thoughtful in comparison with his work with Deftones, leaning more towards electronic rock. Did those promises follow through? Well, sort of, but not in the way that I was expecting. But then again, I'm not sure anyone could have expected this particular hybrid, which has one foot in the gothic dark wave scene and the other in Nine Inch Nails-esque or industrial arena rock. On the one hand, it's a decidedly unique debut album that has enough moments to justify the project's existence. But on the other hand, it's also a weird tonal mishmash that doesn't quite come together or take enough of the strengths of its forebears. And I can't say I found this album all that effective. Okay, for starters, I will say that the seeds of a really great album are here. The production is pretty solid, keeping the menacing tone of dark wave and letting the guitars seethe in the background. They produce a lot of meaty force and impact. And the two instrumental tracks, Cross and Death Bell, they have very solid atmosphere. I'll give them that. And the drums and the drum machines have presence and texture. And there's some interesting progressions that remind me a lot of Depeche Mode in a good way. And there are some great guitar textures on this album, both in the crunchy, sizzling electric end and the Holy Ghost, and the more melancholy acoustic direction, the latter of which I think works way better than what was expected, thanks to alt-rock emo act Far's guitarist Sean Lopez. And while there are some gothic musical flourishes that I did appreciate, the problem immediately begins to start arising when you look at the melody lines. Because while they aren't non-existent, they aren't exactly great either. I'm reminded a bit of weaker Muse tracks that are content to rely on vocal gymnastics and guitar roar rather than solid melody lines. And considering that Crosses is nowhere near as tight and musically as Depeche Mode or Bauhaus or The Cure, nor as explosive as mid-period Nine Inch Nails or Sisters of Mercy, the band just doesn't quite have the musical sticking power of those earlier acts. And while there are some darker tracks, at about the halfway point of this album, the tone gets significantly lighter, and it doesn't really help the overall atmosphere of the album. Now, part of this might be Chino Moreno's delivery. Don't get me wrong, he's a pretty damn good singer, especially when you compare it with some of the other guys in this genre, able to deliver a lot of emotion and not really come across as aggressively annoying or insufferable. He seems to be playing more towards Dave Gaughan's cool disaffection rather than Trent Reznor's self-loathing or aggression. But at the same time, his more emotional, human delivery doesn't exactly help him here. This is where the musical tone is decidedly odd, and one of the places where I'm not quite sure that the genre fusion works as well as they're trying to make it work. Simply put, I never get the feeling that Moreno has completely bought into the darker atmosphere that he's trying to create. And when the musical tone gets lighter, his delivery doesn't exactly lend the songs a lot of dignity or real force. At points, it's hard not to see the emo edge creeping in, and it really doesn't help the instrumental tone. Now, of course, the lyrics help him a little bit here, which takes us to the writing and themes on this album. Now, Crosses was an album comprised of 2 remastered EPs plus 5 more tracks, so I wasn't exactly expecting album themes or a greater overarching coherency. I will say, though, that the tracks flow together better than expected, and the technical songwriting is actually pretty good. Better still, we don't get a lot of the melodrama that cursed chunks of Nine Inch Nails' discography or huge tracks of nu metal. Now, there was some of that melodrama on tracks like Black Stallion, but it seems like Crosses was looking towards gothic subject matter in a typical way. Religion, depression, and of course, sex. And I think this is where the biggest problem comes in on this album. As much as the band is trying to emulate that darker subgenre, the lyrics never really take that additional step to make that material feel fresh or interesting. Have you been listening to goth rock or dark wave or post-punk at all in the past 35 years, nothing on this album lyrically will be remotely revolutionary to you. The one step Crosses takes towards something marginally new would be in the tone, how they present their hookup tracks, which is decidedly weird. Imagine a blend between emo melancholy and arena goth player, where there's some decent descriptive poetry, but it's a strange undercurrent that it's all being said to engineer and necessitate that midnight hookup. And yet, bizarrely, the sexuality is completely downplayed in the lyrics, and I don't know how seriously I'm expected to consider Moreno's advances in these songs. Now, granted, I know it's intentionally more abstract in comparison with Reznor or Gone, but it ends up becoming a weakness on this album because it sucks away some of the weight from this record in some of these songs. And then when you have songs like This Is a Trick and Bitches Brew, which have this air of cattiness and bitterness that doesn't match the tone at all, it leads to the more abstract writing to come across as even more disingenuous. And combined with the strange feeling that Moreno is never quite committing wholeheartedly to the atmosphere and the underlying emotions, plus the lack of truly killer hooks, I can't help but feel rather distant and not all that gripped by this record. And while Moreno is clearly trying and he's conveying emotion, he does succeed mildly here, it rings a little hollow to me, even on the songs I do find pretty solid, like Telepathy, Trophy, and the Epilogue. So to summarize, Crosses is a band that has been criticized by some in the witch house genre as co-opting the imagery and the aesthetics without it really coming across in their music, and I can't help but kind of agree with that. To me, Crosses feels like a side project, where Moreno can stick his toes into the genre but never fully embrace it. And it's that tentative hesitation, the inability to commit musically, that leaves his album stuck between dark wave and gothic arena rock and not really possessing the best traits of either. And yet, bizarrely enough, I don't dislike this album. Yeah, it's not great, but it's decent gothic flavored music, and there are elements and songs that I did like. If you're in high school right now and you are only stepping into gothic music for the first time, this would be a decent starting point. So for me, it's a light 6 out of 10, and it's a tentative recommendation, especially if you find the genre combination appealing. If you compare Crosses to the titans of goth rock and metal, the band falls short in a really big way, and they're not going to start another wave of popularity for the movement in the way that The Cure, Depeche Mode, or Nine Inch Nails did. But you know what? If you're curious, they're worth a listen. So check them out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at coming out this year, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.